Yes, Jeremy, it's important to note that this is a proposal. It's an agreement between SAA and unions and non-unionized employees. This is basically the business rescue practitioners putting forward that due to the lack of funding and given the fact that government has not provided additional funding of 10 billion rand, they have no other option but to terminate the entire workforce of SAA and provide them with conditions to a severance package. Of course, this is a proposal and it just outlines the conditions thereof of these packages, basically reiterating the fact that dependent on the disposal of assets, that will determine when and if the workers will be paid. So basically what will happen is SAA will go into liquidation if this proposal is accepted and if government does announce on Monday that they in fact are going to liquidate. But I think by the looks of this document, they have no other option but to do so. So we're seeing here that if they are able to dispose of assets, the value of those assets will first probably go to the creditors and all the loans that SAA has taken out, the debt on those loans, and then whatever's left of that will go to the workers. So it's going to be a very tough road for the workers, because if the value is not enough, that means that the workers will probably only get their severance packages in about 6 months after this has been implemented.
The only way in which this could be avoided is if there is another lifeline extended by government. We already know that's not going to happen. So this, to all intent and purposes, should, and we'll talk about the unions in just a moment, should this be agreed, it seems they have very little choice. This is the end of the airline.
It is the end of the airline, Jeremy, especially given the fact that when government said no to an additional 10 billion rand funding, they also said no to any additional government guarantees. So that means the business rescue practitioners are not able to go and seek any foreign funding or from foreign markets for any additional funding. So they aren't even able to look elsewhere or outside of the country for additional funding, given the fact that our government has said no. They've already gone to the Development Bank of Southern Africa for a funding of about 4 billion rand. They've already depleted that, and this is why they need an additional 10 billion rand. Government is saying we cannot do this anymore. There is a pandemic in the country. A number of SOEs, businesses, whatever it might be, are in distress at the moment. We cannot justify why we should be giving an airline more money when others are in more desperate need of this. This is the gist of the letter from the Minister of Public Enterprise.
And illustrating the urgency of this, there is a deadline for the unions to respond of when?
The 24th of April, that is next week Friday, so they basically have just over a week to respond to this document, basically whether or not they agree. We've spoken to a number of unions, specifically NUMSA and the Cabin Crew Association, as well as the Pilots Association. They are saying they're unable to speak at this stage. Of course, they need to go back to their members and speak about whether or not they will accept this. They don't have much choice, though, because if the airline is going to liquidate and shut down, where does that leave them? It leaves them with these severance packages, and whether or not they'll get them is also up for discussion, whether or not they'll get the money from disposing of the assets.
The unions have very little choice at this point.
Very little choice, Jeremy. Also because the aviation industry is in very big trouble globally. So even if SAA says we're disposing of these assets, it's to the value of so much, you'll find that whoever might want to buy will say, in actual fact, you are desperate, so I would like to buy it to this value, not to the value that you're putting it up for. And that will be very tricky for the airline, because it will probably mean that because they're so desperate, they'll take the value proposed by the buyer.
We're going to talk to Guy Leach, who's the editor of SA Flyer magazine, in just a moment. He is a respected commentator on the aviation industry. Stick around for that, Heidi, because you might want to chip in and ask him something. But what I do want to ask you is, right now, the airline is flying, isn't it?
Yes, and I think it's important to highlight, Jeremy, that they've actually been doing extremely well in the last 2 to 3 weeks with cargo flights as well as repatriation flights. So other governments have been facilitating with the airline, such as the German government, the Brazilian government, to get their foreign nationals out of South Africa back to their respective countries, and SAA has been facilitating that. SAA has also been collecting essential cargo for South Africa. We know there was a big cargo flight that came in from China, and SAA has been facilitating that. So they've been flying, but it's unfortunate it's just not enough to save the airline at this stage.